In the autumn dust of Montana, a mountain man whispered 3 words to a starving girl that he never meant to say. She laughed, and the sound opened the wound in him that never closed. Subscribe and ring the bell for more tales of love, courage, and the untamed frontier. There are places in this world where God finished His work and walked away without looking back. Montana Territory in the autumn of 1868 was one such place. Mountains thrust upward from the earth like the bones of something ancient and half-buried. Rivers carved through valleys so deep that sunlight only touched bottom a few hours each day. Pine grew so dense along the ridgelines that wind moving through them produced a sound like breathing, the land itself asleep and unwilling to be roused. This was not country that welcomed human beings. It tolerated them the way a river tolerates a stone, by flowing around it, by grinding it down, by reminding it constantly that the water came first, and would remain long after the stone was dust. The men who endured in this wilderness were not civilized men. Cold had shaped them. Altitude had shaped them. Distances so vast that loneliness became a physical thing, a weight lodged in the chest beside the heartbeat. They trapped beaver and marten and fox. They traded pelts at outposts that materialized and vanished with the seasons. They spoke to other men rarely, to themselves constantly, and to God only when the silence grew too heavy to bear without help. Elijah Cord was one of these men, 39 years old, built from the same raw material as the mountains he inhabited, broad through the shoulders, thick in the arms, hands capable of setting a steel trap in frozen earth or skinning an elk in under 20 minutes, or coaxing fire from rain that would have broken weaker men into surrender. His face had weathered past his years. Dark beard shot through with early gray. Deep grooves framed his eyes, carved by snow glare, mountain sun, and distances that demanded immensely farther than most ever need to look. A scar traced his left jawline, where a grizzly had taught him 7 years prior that he was not the most dangerous thing in these mountains. His eyes were dark brown, nearly black, the kind of eyes that swallowed light rather than returning it. Eyes that had witnessed enough to feel several lifetimes and had decided somewhere along the way that revealing what they'd seen served no purpose. He lived alone, had always lived alone, not because loss had stripped someone from him, but because he had never encountered anyone worth the vulnerability that companionship demanded. The mountains were sufficient. The silence was sufficient. The rhythm of seasons and traps and trading posts was sufficient. He repeated this to himself so frequently he almost believed it. The outpost at Bridger Creek was the nearest thing to civilization within 100 miles. A trading post, a blacksmith, a saloon pouring whiskey potent enough to strip rust from iron and regularly employed for that purpose. A loose scatter of tents and shanties where miners and trappers and drifters converged twice a year to exchange what the wilderness provided for what it could not. Elijah rode into Bridger Creek on the 15th of October, a mule behind him, loaded with furs and the list running through his mind: salt, powder, lead, coffee, flour. Plain things, the ingredients of a plain life that asked nothing from anyone and owed nothing in return. The town was busier than usual. A wagon train had halted on its push westward. The travelers mingled with trappers and miners in that uneasy combination born when people who are going somewhere meet people who have stopped going anywhere. He noticed the commotion near the general store first. A small crowd had formed. Not the eager crowd of entertainment, the stiff, uncomfortable crowd of witnessing. The kind that watches something ugly because looking away demands a moral decision they are not prepared to make. He tied his horse and moved closer, not out of concern. The crowd stood between him and the store, and his supplies waited inside. Then he saw her. She was sitting in the dirt beside the wooden steps of the general store. Not sitting by choice, sitting because standing was no longer something her body could manage. She carried the thinness of hunger, not the wiry leanness earned through labor, but the slow erasure of a body feeding on itself. Organs kept running, everything else sacrificed. Her dress had been blue once. Now it wore the shade of dust and surrender. That particular Grey Creek water leaves behind after too many washings, sun too brutal for any dye to hold. Dark hair hung matted around a face smeared with road grime and bone-deep fatigue. 22 years old. Maybe younger. Hard miles and empty meals had stolen any certainty of age, but her eyes remained clear. Brown eyes, holding something that starvation and exhaustion and whatever brutal path delivered her here had failed to kill. The crowd murmured. A woman alone at an outpost carried specific meanings for specific men, and kindness lived in none of them. The store owner stood on the steps above her, arms folded across his chest. He had told her twice already she could not sit there. She hadn't moved because moving cost energy. That currency had run dry days ago. Elijah did not understand why his feet carried him toward her rather than past her. 2 decades of isolation had drilled into him one unbreakable rule: stay clear of other people's troubles. Other people's troubles had edges sharp enough to open anyone who reached for them. His life was clean, simple, free of those edges. He wanted it kept that way. But his boots moved forward, as though his body had reached a verdict without consulting his mind. He stood over her, this enormous mountain man wrapped in cracked leather, fur piled on his mule, silence pulled deep in his eyes. He looked down at a girl in the dirt who weighed less than his winter pack. She was sinking into the ground beneath her as if the earth had already begun reclaiming what starvation would soon enough finish delivering. The words fell out before thought could catch them, before that instinct which had kept him alive and solitary for 20 years could intervene with its familiar counsel, that silence was always safer. "Can I buy you?" He meant food, he meant provisions, he meant the plain practical offer of a man who understood barter and transaction. "I have money, you are starving, let me purchase something from this store." Straightforward as skinning a deer. But the words his mouth produced were not the words his mind had shaped. They were clumsy, graceless. The words of a man so long removed from human speech that the machinery had rusted shut. What came out was broken and wrong, and freighted with a meaning he never intended. The crowd heard those words. The store owner heard them. The man standing close heard them, and drew exactly the conclusion such words would invite at a frontier outpost where women were scarce and morality bent easy. She heard them too. She lifted her face from the dust. Those brown eyes found his dark ones, and in the gap between one heartbeat and the next, something happened that caught them both unprepared. She laughed. Not bitter, not mocking, not the defensive laugh of a woman trained to wield humor as armor against men who appraise her like livestock. A real laugh, genuine, the startled, helpless, involuntary sound of a person confronted with something so absurd the body answers before the mind can object. A laugh rising from the belly, despite the belly holding nothing. It filled the space around the general store, bounced off rough-planed walls, reached every ear present. But it entered Elijah Court differently. It passed through a door he never knew was there, a door hidden somewhere behind his ribs, one that 20 years of mountains and silence and fierce self-reliance had not sealed as completely as he believed. The laugh slipped through that opening and touched something inside him no thing had ever reached, something soft. Something that had survived the grizzly and the killing winters and the vast loneliness only because it lay buried so deep even he had forgotten its existence. It was there. His soul cracked open. Not loudly, not with any drama. The way ice fractures on a river in early spring. A sound so faint only the water running beneath it knows that something has changed. But the crack was there. And through it poured something warm, something he carried no word for, because he'd never once required one. He stood frozen. This enormous man, who had stared down charging grizzlies, crossed rivers sheeted in ice, endured the absolute vacancy of mountain winters alone. He stood over a laughing, starving girl in the dust, and felt the whole architecture of his life shift beneath him. Like ground he'd trusted that was never solid at all. "You cannot buy a person," she said when the laugh died. Her voice came out raw from thirst and long silence, but the words landed clean. They carried a dignity her circumstances should have crushed, but hadn't. Quote 2. He managed. Quote 3. She studied his face. She saw the scar, the weathering, the confusion, and underneath all of it, the bewildered honesty of a man who had said the wrong thing for the right reason. __, quote _4, __, she replied. Something shifted at the corner of her cracked lips, the ghost of a second smile. Her name was Nora Callahan. She gave it to him over a plate of stew he bought at the outpost kitchen. She ate slowly. Her stomach had forgotten abundance and needed reintroduction by degrees. She had traveled west with a family not her own, worked for them, cooked, cleaned, minded their children through the crossing. When the family reached Bridger Creek, the husband decided an extra mouth was a luxury the frontier wouldn't carry. He left her with nothing. No money, no provisions. No explanation beyond the cold arithmetic of survival in a land where compassion cost dear and selfishness came free. She had been alone at the outpost 11 days, sleeping beneath the general store, eating whatever she could scavenge, which was nearly nothing, waiting for a wagon train heading further west, or a miracle heading anywhere at all. Elijah listened. He was good at listening because it demanded silence, and silence was his mother tongue. He absorbed her story the way he absorbed the mountains, with patience, with attention, with the knowledge that what was spoken mattered less than what lived beneath it. He offered her work at his cabin, 30 miles north into the high country. Cooking, maintaining the homestead while he ran his trap lines. Fair wages, separate quarters. The professional arrangement of a man who needed help with domestic work he'd been doing poorly for 20 years. That is what he told her. That is what he told himself. But the crack was already there, and through it, warmth was spreading into territories frozen so long they had forgotten what thaw meant. She accepted. The alternative was dirt beneath the general store and the slow, patient hunger erasing her one day at a time. They rode north into the mountains. She sat on the mule among bundled furs. He walked beside his horse and said nothing for 3 hours. She did not ask him to speak. She understood instinctively that this man's silence was not emptiness. It was fullness. A life so complete in its solitude that words were foreign currency he spent with reluctance. The cabin surprised her. Solid, well constructed. Warm in ways she hadn't expected from a man who seemed built entirely of stone and quiet. Books lined the shelf above the fireplace. Poetry, history, a worn Bible with passages underlined in pencil. The interior of this cabin told the story the exterior of this man concealed. The story of someone who thought deeply, felt deeply, and had chosen isolation not because he lacked the capacity for connection, but because connection frightened him more than any bear or blizzard ever had. Autumn deepened. The aspens turned gold, then bare. Snow appeared on the peaks and crept toward the valley with the slow certainty of something that had done this 10,000 times and would do it 10,000 more. They found the rhythm. He trapped, she cooked. He brought meat, she preserved it. He repaired the cabin. She organized its interior with a precision that turned shelter into home. They ate together in the evenings beside the fire, and the silence between them changed texture. Less like absence, more like presence. The silence of two people who have no use for words. Because proximity spoke first. Because consistency spoke louder. Because the quiet accumulation of shared days said everything language fumbles to express. She noticed things about him, how he pulled his boots off before crossing the threshold, as if the space she kept deserved that reverence. How wildflowers appeared on the table without explanation or ceremony. How he read poetry beside the fire, lips moving soundlessly, shaping words like prayers he wasn't ready to release into the air. He noticed things about her. The humming while she cooked. Melodies from a life he'd never touched. The way she stood in the cabin doorway each morning and studied the mountains as though they'd rebuild themselves overnight. The way her laugh arrived unannounced, without reason, and filled the room the way firelight filled it. Warm, alive, the specific comfort of something burning in a cold world. The crack in his soul widened, not painfully, gently. The way a bud splits its casing. The way first light bleeds across a ridge. So slow, the moment of change stays invisible, only the result undeniable. Winter came down with full authority. Snow swallowed the valley whole. Trails vanished. The world shrank to the cabin, the woodpile, the frozen creek, and two people sharing a space built for one man who had been certain one was enough. On a December evening, she found the poetry book lying open on the table, a passage freshly underlined in pencil. She read it by firelight, while he pretended to mend a trap that needed no mending. The words spoke of water found in desert country, of warmth discovered in the last place a man would look, of a soul's capacity to unseal itself after years of believing the lock was permanent. She closed the book, crossed the small cabin, laid her hand over his, scarred, rough, enormous, still pretending to work on a trap already perfect. She whispered. His dark eyes found her brown ones. He said. The fire crackled, snow pressed against the windows. Mountain silence wrapped the cabin like something ancient and protective. He said. Her hand tightened on his. Firelight caught the glisten in her eyes. She said softly. They married in spring, when the snow pulled back and the valley floor revealed itself again, green and new, impossibly beautiful after months of white. No preacher, no witnesses, just words exchanged beside Bridger Creek while snowmelt rushed past, carrying winter away. Years settled over them the way mountain light settles, gentle, golden. A daughter came first, then a son. The cabin grew. Laughter filled the valley the way birdsong did, naturally, without effort, without anyone summoning it. Nora Callahan grew strong in the mountain air. Her body reclaimed what hunger had stolen. Her face took on the particular beauty that comes when a person occupies the exact place they belong. Her laugh never changed. Sudden, warm. The sound that had cracked a mountain man's soul open and let the light flood through. Elijah Cord softened in ways only she could see. The silence remained, but its nature transformed. No longer the silence of isolation. The silence of a man who has everything he needs inside walls he raised with hands that once believed their sole purpose was survival. Travelers passing through the valley in later years sometimes mentioned the homestead in the mountains, the stone cabin beside the creek, the tall, quiet man and the dark-haired woman whose laugh traveled across the water. Children playing among the pines, as if the wilderness were a garden planted solely for them. They said the man carried a scar on his jaw and poetry on his shelf, that he possessed a gentleness which contradicted his size, the way a spring contradicts the rock it flows from. They said the woman would tell it sometimes, a story about a day in the dust outside a general store. How a mountain man asked her the wrong question, how she laughed, and how that laugh traveled through the years the way a river cuts through canyon rock, shaping everything it touched, slowly, gently, permanently. Some people search the whole world for what they need, cross oceans, deserts, entire mountain ranges, hunting for the thing that makes a life complete. Others find it in the dirt outside a trading post, in a clumsy question and a genuine laugh, in the simple, terrifying act of saying the wrong words to the right person and discovering those wrong words were exactly right, because they were honest. And honesty is the only language the heart has ever recognized. Can I buy you? No, you cannot, but you can sit beside me while I eat the stew you paid for. You can walk me into your mountains, show me your poetry and your silence, and the cabin you built for one person that has always had room for two. You can ask me to stay using words you have never spoken before, and I will stay. Not because you bought me, because you broke yourself open in front of me and let me see what lived inside. What lived inside was worth more than gold. That is what the mountains remember, not the harshness, not the cold, not the winters that test the absolute limit of what living things can endure. Nora, the mountains remember the laughter. A girl in the dust, a man on his knees without kneeling, a question asked wrong and answered right, the sound of something cracking open that was never meant to stay closed. The valley still holds her laugh. If you listen close where Bridger Creek bends past the old stone foundation, you can hear it, mixed with snowmelt and birdsong and the quiet breathing of mountains that have been keeping this story since before anyone thought to write it down. Some say the cabin still stands, some say only the chimney remains. But the laugh survives. It always survives.